Okay guys, welcome back to our video series. This time we're going to be starting with Unit 3, and in this unit we're going to cover some pretty broad categories. Again, we're going to talk about tissues, we'll talk about glands, then we'll talk a bit about membranes, and then finally we'll introduce our first organ system, which is the integumentary system. So let's get going. So first of all, what are tissues? Well, tissues are groups of cells that are arranged within the body within a specific pattern. They have a similar structure and they have generally a similar function. The study of tissues is called histology, and well, we're going to do a lab on histology where we're going to look at the cells that make up different types of tissues in the body. And that's a pretty busy lab, so I think you guys will like that one. Lots of microscope work. So all tissues in our body will derive from, or that means they come from, these really young cells that are quite actively dividing, that we call our stem cells. So our stem cells will produce these different types of tissues, and stem cells are a really special type of cell because they have incredible abilities to produce tissues for one thing, but in a lot of cases stem cells can produce any structure. It depends on how they're influenced from different messengers, hormones, timing, and so on and so forth. So they're a really interesting group of cells. And depending on what type of tissue we're talking about, or depending on where it's located and what the function is, those cells will have different rates of reproduction. So it makes for a pretty interesting study if you choose to study histology. Now, in the human body, we look at 4 general tissue types. Okay, epithelial tissue. Now, these are the types of tissues that cover the surfaces of the body. They'll also be found inside of the cavities of the body. So the cavities we talked about in Unit 1, those are going to be lined by epithelial cells. And they also form glands, and we're going to talk really briefly about that in this unit, and we'll talk in a lot more detail about it in a unit later on. The second tissue is the connective tissue, and this is a supportive type of tissue. It forms the framework for all parts of the body. It helps hold the body in places in a lot of situations. It provides a lot of structure, rigid framework for muscles to work against, and so on and so forth. The next type of tissue we have is muscle tissue, and muscle tissue is its sole function, well, it's sole function, but one of its major function is to get shorter. That's what muscle tissues do. So that's called contraction. And when muscle tissue contracts, it causes movement. You can have movement on a big scale, like us walking around, using our skeletal muscles to move, and you can have movement on a smaller scale, for example, peristalsis in our digestive tract, which will push food through our digestive tract. It's still movement, still accomplished by muscle tissue, but it's on a much different scale. And then finally, the last tissue we'll look at is nervous tissue. And nervous tissue is specialized to conduct signals. So collect information about the environment through sensors on the outside of the body. Collect information about the inside of the body through sensors there. Relay those signals to our central nervous system, the spinal cord, and the brain, so that that information can be processed and dealt with. So those are the 4 different types of tissue. We'll talk about some of them in a little bit more detail in this unit, and we'll visit some more in later units. So let's first talk about the epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissues, or sometimes it's called epithelium, those are the tissues that line the inner and outer portions of the body. So our skin, for example, is epithelial tissue. It's epithelial cells. So it gives us our very important protective outer coating. So our skin protects us from the environment, which is super important. Epithelial tissues will also form membranes. They'll also form ducts within our body that can transport everything from hormones to blood to digestive secretions and so on and so forth. All of those ducts are going to be lined and in part made up of epithelial tissue. It's going to line those body cavities that we talked about in the first unit. It's also going to line our hollow organs. If you think about our digestive tube, for example, that's going to be covered in epithelial cells. Our respiratory tract. And these tissues are also going to make up, in some cases, large portions of glands. study in this unit, a study tip would be to make one of those mind maps that I talked about in other units, or a branching tree, to put the different parts of the epithelial tissue, the connective tissue, and so on and forth. Try and organize those so that you understand where each tissue fits in. Okay, because even though we've got 4 different tissues, we've got different types of each type of tissue. So it gets a little bit more complicated as we get into a little bit more detail. So generally, when we're talking about epithelial cells, we further classify them. Okay, we classify them in 2 different ways. First, we use its shape. So when we're talking about shape, we're talking about these 3 classifications here. Squamous cells are what we see in our cheek cell that we will see in the lab, and those are flat, but they're irregular shaped cells. Oftentimes you'll see them, and people call them fried egg cells because they kind of look like a fried egg. We've got a bigger nucleus in the middle, and the outside is kind of irregular in shape. The next ones we can have are these cuboidal cells, and they're exactly what the name suggests. They're shaped like a cube. We've got a nucleus in the middle, and then we also have these columnar ones, which are shaped like a rectangle. So that's one way that we identify or classify epithelial tissues. Now, depending on the function of that tissue, we'll have those different shapes found in different parts of the body. For example, the squamous ones are found in our epithelium to make up our skin. The cuboidal ones we'll find lining a lot of the ducts that pass through our body. In our kidneys, for example. We'll also find them sometimes near blood vessels. And the columnar ones, those we find in our respiratory system. So depending on the shape, and that provides them with a certain function, and that'll also dictate on where or what location we can find them on in our bodies. So one way we classify them is by their shape. The next way that we classify them is by their arrangement. Okay, so we have 3 different arrangements that we look at when we're talking about epithelial cells. We can have simple, which means that that tissue is arranged in a single cell layer. Okay, it forms a barrier between one environment and the internal environment of the body. So that's simple. We can have them stratified. Stratified is a fancy word for layered. Okay, so if a tissue is stratified, you find several layers of cells that function, that can protect an area of wear and tear. For example, our skin is stratified epithelial tissue. We've got lots of layers of cells in our skin, which helps give us protection. And finally, we have a third type that's called transitional. Now, transitional epithelial tissues is found in areas where we need to have that tissue or organ or gland or whatever it should be can change shape for some reason or another. So we'll find transitional epithelial, for example, in our urinary bladder, in our stomach, and it allows that organ to fill up, to change shape, to expand, and then when it's empty, it goes back to a smaller size and the tissue isn't damaged. So two different ways we classify epithelials, by their shape and by their arrangement. Now, this next slide should be able to explain that a little bit better. But one thing to remember is we look at things in more than one. So we can have the shape and the arrangement used at the same time. So on this axis up here, we're going to be using shape. And down here, we're going to be using arrangement. So we can have the very simplest type of epithelial tissues, which will be simple squamous or simple cuboidal or simple columnar. You can see the different shapes of the cells. And then we can get a little bit more complicated. We can get into stratified, so you can see how they're stacked up or layered. You can have this one over here, which is kind of a special example called pseudo-stratified. Now, pseudo, and you'll see that a lot in biology, pseudo means false. So pseudo-stratified means it's false stratified. So if you look at this tissue here, the pseudo-stratified columnar, those cells aren't actually stacked on top of each other. They just look like it. So that's why we call them pseudostratified. So this is a way that we can look at epithelial tissues and arrange them a little bit differently, or classify them a little bit differently, using their shape and their arrangement. Now, some of these tissues have very special functions. Goblet cells that we find in our stomach or in our respiratory tract, these will be specialized to produce mucus. So we need to have mucus present in our respiratory tract to help gases dissolve so they can diffuse across the lung tissue. And we need mucus in our stomachs, in our digestive system, so that the inside of the organ doesn't get damaged by stuff like stomach acid or proteolytic enzymes. So we have these goblet cells. They're epithelial tissues, but they're specialized to secrete mucus so that they protect the inside of the body. Some of those epithelial cells will have cilia. Now, cilia are tiny finger-like projections. They look like little tiny fingers or little tiny hairs, and they're used for movement in some cases. So in the case of our respiratory system, we'll have columnar epithelial cells that kind of look like this, and they'll have cilia up on the top here. So they're columnar in shape because they're shaped like a rectangle, and then they have that cilia on the top. And what that cilia is going to do is it's going to help move that mucus around inside of our lungs so that, one, it can help the gases dissolve, and two, it can trap anything that we breathe in. So if you're breathing in dust or viruses or bacteria, it can get stuck on that mucus, and those cilia can move the mucus, the cilia can move that mucus around, and eventually we'll swallow it. And if we swallow that mucus, there's a good chance that that virus or that bacteria, that dust, can cause us no harm whatsoever. So it's certainly a protective function. Epithelial cells are kind of lucky because they repair themselves and they replace themselves quite quickly. And that's good because generally they're forming some type of protection. So if a cell becomes damaged or if it gets old, it needs to be replaced and replenished really, really fast in order to keep that protection going. So here's a couple of examples of different epithelial cells, tissue, that have this special function. So on the top one up here, you can actually see the cilia, those little tiny finger-like projections that are right on the top of the cells there. And those are the ones that are going to be in our trachea, for example, and that's going to move that mucus around so that it has that protective function that I just spoke about. Down here in the digestive system, you're going to see those little tiny goblet cells right here. And they're going to secrete mucus, and that mucus will move up here and lay on top of this tissue, so that any stomach acid or anything that we might eat that could damage our stomach lining or intestinal lining, it'll get cut off and protected by the mucus before it can actually damage the cells or the tissue. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about glands. So glands are going to be these specialized structures. They're made out of mostly epithelial tissues, but they're specialized to produce a substance that's moved around the body. Okay, generally a gland will produce a messenger chemical that we often call a hormone, and that hormone will be produced in a gland, and then it's sent somewhere else in the body to have an effect. And we characterize glands into two different major categories. The first ones we have exocrine gland. So in an exocrine gland, what happens is the gland will produce its hormone or its secretion, and that will be collected into a duct or a tube, and that duct or tube will carry the secretions to other parts of the body where that hormone will have an effect. So some examples of exocrine glands are the lacrimal glands that we find in our eyes that help produce tears, sebaceous glands that we find in our skin that'll produce sweat, and the salivary glands that we find in our mouth that produce the saliva that flows into our mouth to help us with digestion. Now we can also have endocrine glands. Now these secrete their products directly into the surrounding tissue, and then the blood will help carry the hormones and the messengers around. So some examples of endocrine glands are the thyroid gland and the adrenal gland.